Okay, and we are live. Hello, and everyone, and welcome to MBA Waves. We are on the air. Today, we have a topic that I think is near and dear to the hearts of many, or perhaps uh, putting trepidation and fear into the hearts of many as well, and that is the GMAT. And more specifically on MBA Waves, this is episode 44. The topic is the hidden advantages of taking the GMAT or GRE or EA. We're going to get into that as well. As always, I am joined by Bara Sapir, who is my co-creator of MBA Waves. Bara, say hello.
Hi, good to see everybody. Good to see you, Vinay, and you, Eric. Good
You're going to give us
morning.
the weather report in the Bay Area today?
I gotta tell you, I don't even want to talk about it. It is so gray and chilly outside, but luckily we got some rain yesterday, I believe, which is really much needed in this climate change world that we live in. So that's the weather report.
So Bara is the founder of City Test Prep, and why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Oh, I could do that. I'd be happy to tell you about that. So I am the CEO of City Test Prep, also MindFlow. City Test Prep is a full service test preparation company. We work with students middle school through the medical boards, and I happen to love the GMAT. I actually have a GMAT book out, published by Nova Press. And really the way that we look at it is that students need to master content, strategy, and also have a great mindset and time management. So we deal with those 4 pillars of learning.
Thanks, Bara. And also with us today, we have Vinay Narang, who is from GMAT Genius. So why don't you introduce yourself and GMAT Genius, Vinay?
Wonderful. Thank you, Eric. And thank you, Eric and Bara, for having me. I'm excited today. Just for a special company focused on GMAT and the executive assessment preparation for both exams, specifically with private tutoring. And our specialty really is helping people who are a bit stuck at a certain level push through to the higher levels. And we've been fortunate to work with many hundreds of clients, get them into wonderful.
I'm in Singapore. Singapore. What am I saying? I'm in Strasbourg in Eastern France. What am I saying about Singapore? I have no idea. Maybe I wish I was in Singapore, but it was a bit warmer than here in Strasbourg. And I am the founder of Candidate Coach, which is a full service MBA admissions consulting firm. I work with MBA students, or candidates, I should say, from all around the world, targeting MBA programs all around the world as well. And along with Bara, about 10, 11 months ago, we've created MBA Waves as a way to reach people, to have discussions about anything related to MBAs, business schools, GMATs, and so forth. Usually we have guests each week, and you can see our program schedule for upcoming episodes at mbawaves.com. You can also see past episodes, recordings of past episodes on the past episodes tab. And well, we're going to just jump right into it. So as this week's topic is about advantages of taking the GMAT or GRE, let's start by doing a little breakdown of what these tests are. And by the way, either one of you can respond. Since testing is really your domain, I'm going to do most of the question asking and allow you guys to respond. I might chime in here and there. So yeah, let's do a little breakdown about these tests: the GRE, the GMAT, and the EA. Like when they were created, why, what's the purpose they serve, and who are they for, as well as not for. So either one of you wants to take away.
I want to just, before we get into the test, I want to tell you about a conversation I had early this morning. I mentioned I had been up early this morning, and it was with a student who is taking. He's got a law degree from Germany, and he's considering going to business school to get another dual degree in the States. And he was going back and forth saying, well, I don't know if I should take the LSAT, the GRE, or the GMAT. And it was really interesting to have the conversation with him because he already has a law degree. And he said to me, I don't think the schools are telling me the truth. I don't think that they do have a threshold of scores that they'll accept students at, but they don't say it in public. So what should I do? And so, I think that for him, based on what he wants to do, that I think the GMAT will probably be the best test for him, but he should take one of each to see how he does on each of them. But I think that right now students get very confused because schools are not telling them what they should take, but in all their written material, it talks about the range of scores of what their students are scoring. So just to start us off, that you want to get the highest score that you can get. Really, you want to earn the highest score and not think that because the schools are being a little bit vague. And maybe, Eric, you have something to say about the scores. having colleagues in the field that deal with this. But I do think that it's important that no matter what the schools are saying, that it is important that you put your best foot forward and prepare for them. And that's just a preamble to what we're going to talk about. But I do think that that's important to bring up.
Yeah, 100%. Like the higher the score, the better. I will say this, though, in the world of MBA admissions, that most of my colleagues in schools around the world have come to sort of consensus on this, that the GMAT is not the most important thing in terms of MBA admissions. Usually, most schools will talk about they're looking at the full composite of the profile, the various components, the interview being very important, your experience, all the essays, of course, all these things play a part along with the GMAT. So it's not the most important part, but it is.
It's a data. It's a data point. It's a data
point. But let's pivot over to scholarships, right? GMAT becomes very important often when we're talking about merit-based scholarships. And I try to tell people to look at it as like a contest to win money, right? And you do want to get the best score possible, and that will often bring you the most likely possibility of hitting some serious scholarship.
Yeah, and I think I would agree with what both of you said. It's fundamental that everybody put their best foot forward in all parts of their application. And the GMAT or the GRE, the EA is just one data point, but it's an important data point. And it's just a way, we'll get more into this later, of course, but how to differentiate yourself. And I think you should determine up front, as Bara said, which test is best for you. You don't want to go down a certain path to regret it later. If you're going to put your effort into preparing for a test, let's pick the right exam for you and make sure that you can put your best foot forward. But I also agree with you that the waters have been muddied, I think, over the past few years. To your point, Bara, I think it used to be pretty clear that this was always traditionally an essential component of applications, but I think the waters have been muddied over the past few years.
Yeah, there's a lot of conversation now because California schools are not accepting, or they're not really looking at the SATs or the ACTs. They're either test waiver, test blind, and test optional. And there's a little bit of the waters are just very choppy right now. So the one thing to remember about any standardized test is that it's a data point, and it's a data point. And Vinay, you said this. It allows you to be compared to every other student who's applying. So when you take a standardized test, you want to get your best score, not just for yourself, but because you're going to be compared to all these other people. And it's not as important with what you were saying, Eric. It's not as important as these other pieces, but it is important to be able to see where are you on that spectrum, right? So it's great that it's not the most important thing, but it's still an important data point because the schools want to know, okay, well, how do you measure up to all the other people who are applying?
So you're kind of like lining into what I was asking. What purpose do these tests serve? And maybe differentiating a little bit between the two.
Yeah, I'd be happy to jump in on that. I think that's a great question, Eric. Fundamentally, as Bara said, the schools need a way to be able to understand how candidates compare to each other. It's only one data point, but the other data points, unfortunately, are not directly comparable. We can't look at a GPA from one school with a certain major versus somebody else with a different GPA from another program with another major. How could an admissions officer or a program accurately understand how those two directly compare? So a standardized test is just that. It's standardized. It allows programs to understand on this specific measure, how do these candidates compare? And that doesn't necessarily mean that the one who scores lower is out. It just means let's understand how we can help this person. What other advantages does this person bring? Or, maybe if this person is going to a program, let's make sure that they have the tools necessary so they can succeed in the program. If perhaps their math skills are a little bit weaker, how can they shore that up so that they're ready to succeed academically once they enter the program?
Right. So like the Dalai Lama could get a 400 and he's going to get into any business school he wants to go to, right? But the other thing that these tests measure, the way that I look at this is, and the way that we do, is that it really simulates who you are as a business professional and who you are going in thinking like a business leader. So the questions specifically of the GMAT and the EA, because those tests they're basically the same test, but just formatted a little bit differently, that they have questions that will measure your risk. They'll measure your speed. They'll measure your reasoning. They'll measure to see, do you think outside of the box? As compared to the GRE, which is more like the SAT on steroids.
Yeah.
This is much more of a reasoning test. So not every student who's applying to business school needs to take the GMAT. They can take the GRE, and some schools even accept the MCAT, which is the medical school test, or the LSAT.
Or the LSAT, yeah.
Yeah, so you can take these other tests, but the GMAT in particular I find that it really simulates business professional thinking, business leadership thinking. Vinay, do you have anything to add to
Yeah,
that?
no, I think that's spot on, Bara. In fact, over the years, schools have become more flexible, as you mentioned, Bara, in what tests they accept. And I think the reasoning behind that is to allow a greater applicant pool. There are certain people who maybe are intimidated by the GMAT and don't want to take the GMAT. And so offering a broader array of tests as an admissions criteria allows schools to broaden their applicant base. But fundamentally, the GMAT is designed for MBA programs because it tests critical thinking skills and the type of skills that are important for succeeding both in business school as well as beyond. Whereas the GRE is more of a traditional knowledge-based test, as you said, Bara. The SAT on steroids is a great way to put it.
I think it's also worth mentioning for people who are new in this process, like some of the other differences. Like the GRE is a test for graduate school in a whole multitude of domains, not just business, right? And I don't know how many takers there are each year for the GRE versus the GMAT. If either of you know, you can feel free to jump in. But for business schools, particularly MBA programs, that tends to be the traditional test that is accepted for admissions. But more and more, since I would say at least 10, 15 years or so, nearly all of the MBA programs that I'm aware of, top 100 ranked MBA programs do accept both. And I'm also hearing more and more MBA. There's not a whole lot, but some accepting other alternative assessments or psychometric tests, that they provide on their own, which is another option. But their schools seem to be few and far between. And since people typically apply for 3 to 5 MBA programs, not putting all their eggs in one basket, right? They end up usually having to take the GMAT or GRE anyway. So it's definitely worth it for any applicants out there to be checking out the website. It should be absolutely clear on the website what tests are required or accepted. If it's not clear, talk to a recruiter, but making sure that you're taking the test that is appropriate for the school that you're applying to. But as Vinay and Bara were saying, like taking the test that is best suited to you is also interesting. And the easiest way to find that out is to take a simulation, right? Try out each one.
Yeah, I think it's also important to mention that some jobs require a GMAT score after business school. Yeah. So if you're not taking the GMAT to get into business school, you might wind up having to take it anyway, because I can't tell you what companies will want that, but it is not far-fetched.
Yeah, primarily in the management consulting field.
Right.
So we're talking about MBB, McKinsey, Bain, BCG. These companies very often will want to see a GMAT score. So this is something we're going to get into a little bit later, but like the value of a GMAT score even post MBA program.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the farther away you are, like the sooner you take any standardized test from your undergrad, the better. So even like it's because your mind is fertile, your mind is nimble in that way. So because the test is good for 5 years, the scores are good for 5 years. When the sooner you take it, the better.
Yeah, it's a struggle for people to get back into taking the test after they've been out of school for a long time. And in fact, that's one of the reasons, and we'll get into this, Eric, more, but the executive assessment was created because that's primarily for people applying for executive MBA programs. And we're talking about individuals now who've been out of undergraduate for 10, 15, maybe even more years. And for them, trying to remember things like the area of a triangle, how do we calculate that? It's obviously very challenging. So yes, because the scores are good for 5 years, the sooner you take them when you're still familiar with this, first of all, just the mindset of studying, being used to studying and having those good habits developed, we hope, as well as, of course, closer familiarity with the content that can only serve as an advantage.
So speaking about differences, like something that I've always heard and understood between the GMAT and the GRE, first speaking, that math is math, and pretty much they're the same. The quant stuff is pretty much the same on both tests, versus in the verbal for GRE is more vocabulary heavy and more grammar heavy on the GMAT. Do you both agree with that? Or
I think largely yes. I mean, on the vocabulary, it's definitely a different focus. I mean, almost every standardized test out there has reading comprehension. But then other than that, the GRE is definitely more vocabulary focused. The GMAT is more grammar and logic focused. The math, I think, on the GRE is definitely easier, but kind of as Bara alluded to earlier, it's more straightforward math, whereas the GMAT is really using your knowledge of math to test your critical thinking abilities. So it's not a straightforward application. Do I know this math rule? Do I know this formula? But how can I quickly, creatively, and strategically derive the right answer as quickly as possible, which often does not entail doing out a lot of math. And that's, in fact, an important mind shift for people taking the GMAT, people who say, I'm really good at math. I'm going to do great on it. And then I say, great, take a practice test. Let's see how you do. And they don't do so well because they're not approaching the test the right way.
So this is quant reasoning. It sounds like you're talking about.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's interesting because the GRE they both have problem solving questions, right? So it's like straight, here's a question, and then there's answer choices, and you just get the answer. The GRE has a section, basically quantitative comparison, which is similar to the SAT, where you have A, B, C, D, where like A is bigger, B is bigger, C is their equal, or D, I don't have enough information. On the GMAT, they have something called data sufficiency, which is, it just turns everything on its head. And if a student hasn't seen this or thought about it, it's, do I have enough data to answer this question? So you're not actually getting an answer, but deciding if A gives you enough information, if B gives you enough information, C, you need both of that, they both have the information, or D, that it just, you don't have enough information, like it just doesn't work. And it's a little bit, they're kind of similar, but they're different. And exactly what Vinay is saying, it's, you need to meet the test where the test is at, not, it's a mutual, I've often talked about the GMAT and standardized tests as being a dance, right? And you really need to know, you need to respond to your dance partner. It's not a solo dance situation. So each of these math pieces, and I would say objectively, the GRE is a little bit easier, the math, but it's the approach also and how you go in and how you practice that and plan for it that makes it easier.
So you're really starting to get into a little bit of what's test strategy. And before we continue, just wanted to mention, I forgot to say it earlier, for anyone listening to us either via LinkedIn, Facebook, or YouTube, you should be able to write in your questions on the platform, and we should be able to see that on our side so we can answer some questions. But Vinay, you were talking about, when we were talking one-to-one earlier before we started, about some differences in the math with the EA, the executive assessment, versus the GMAT. You mentioned like there's not as much of a focus on geometry.
Correct. So the executive assessment, because it was designed for candidates taking the pursuing an executive MBA and really who have been out of school longer, the GMAC, who administers both tests, views the executive assessment as more of a readiness test. And so there is, on the math side, well, first, there are some important differences. First, as you said, Eric, there's a de-emphasis of geometry. We don't really see geometry as much. Second, the executive assessment is what we call a section adaptive test, as opposed to a question adaptive test, which means you get, on the math side, for example, two sets of questions. Two sections of questions of 7 each. And so your performance on the first 7 questions will determine the difficulty level of the next 7 questions. And because it's section adaptive, you have an ability to skip questions on an executive assessment, come back to it, and then you kind of submit your answers for the complete section before proceeding to the next section. Whereas the GMAT, you don't have that luxury. It's a question adaptive test. The question difficulty varies based on your performance on the prior question. So in a sense, there are some tools built into the executive assessment to alleviate some of the stress that perhaps might get caused for test takers. We also find another important difference is the integrated reasoning is a very important role on the executive assessment. It contributes equally as quantitative and verbal due to the overall score, whereas on the GMAT, the integrated reasoning section is a completely separate score that does not factor into the overall score.
Very interesting to think about the structure and the nature of the test in each sections and how you would approach that strategically to maximize your results, basically.
But the thing is with the results is that the GMAT, your score is really super important, right? Like, whereas the EA, you really just want to get a certain threshold. Like you really want to get at least a 50%. So the understanding is that you're coming in as an executive and that the MBA is going to be a different kind of training for an executive than the MBA is going to be a training for the person who's just had 3 to 5 years of work experience. So the tests are reflecting that. And remember that the main customer of the GMAT and the EA are the schools themselves. So they're really behind the kind of thinking and design that the tests are. Like, so even though the student is paying for the actual taking of the test, they're a different kind of, they're an end user, and the customers are the schools themselves, the business schools themselves.
Right. So before we pivot back to some of the advantages, the hidden advantages of taking these tests, I want to just talk about some of the complaints that people might have. Either it could come from the school side or more likely the test taker side, the applicant side. What are some of the difficulties, challenges, complaints that you typically hear about the GMAT and other standardized tests?
Yeah. Well, the biggest one that I hear is, why do I have to take this in the first place? Why is this even relevant to business school? And, I think it goes back to what we've talked about. It really doesn't measure, do you know the formula to calculate the area of a triangle? Sure, probably you're not going to use that when you're negotiating a deal out in the business world. But the GMAT is not about that. It's about measuring your critical thinking skills, about how do you look at data, extract the relevant data, quickly, creatively, and strategically derive the right answer to a mini problem. And that's how we need to view it. It's really testing your ability to think creatively, strategically, and on your feet.
Yeah.
Renee, I wonder if you have this. This is the number one complaint that I get. It's, I work really hard. I don't have the time to study.
Sure.
And it's remarkable how every GMAT, first of all, I have to say, I love my GMAT students out of all my students the best. I just find them to be, I don't know. I really adore I've always loved my GMAT students. And every single one of them thinks they're the only person in the world taking the GMAT that is so busy, and that they've got so many things that how could they possibly have enough time to prepare for it? And more than any other test taker, I hear this from my GMAT students. It's really interesting.
Yeah, I have to work. I have a job. I'm like, almost everyone.
Eric, do you hear that from students too?
Yeah.
Do you hear yeah. I mean, it's incredible. I mean, I know I do ask my students for their schedule so I can see what's going on, and they do have really busy lives. And I'm like, oh, but you've got time between 7 a.m. and 7:45 a.m. They're like, I'm sleeping. I'm like, well, that will be a really good time for you to wake up and do a little bit of work before you start your day.
Yeah, and I think we have to look ahead. I mean, the reality is when you go into business school, I have my MBA from Stanford, although it's been a few years, but I remember how busy it was when you're in the midst of an MBA program. I mean, you've got, of course, your classes, you've got the social, you've got recruiting, you've got projects. There's so much going on that you have to manage your time, and you have to prioritize, where do I want to spend my time? And even when you're not in the working world, if you're working for a management consulting firm or some of these other firms, you're going to be working long hours, and you need to manage your time. So part of this is demonstrating to schools. So, when we talk about the advantages of taking a test like this, you're demonstrating to a school that, one, you're serious, that you can manage your time, you can fit this in, you can balance the workload, you can take a challenging exam, you can prepare for the challenging exam. You're demonstrating to school that you have these skills and therefore will do well within their academic program.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're starting to get the advantages, and that's something that we've talked about a lot in terms of advantages of taking the test is, well, the MBA itself is teaching you to take time management to just the next level, right? And it starts before the program. And a lot of people will say the GMAT or the GRE is kind of like your first MBA class, sort of warming up your brain, especially to Vinay's point earlier, for those who've been out of school for a while now. They're not used to being in a classroom, used to sitting down, answering test questions. And so it kind of gets you back into the right mindset to warm up your brain for that MBA program.
It's also setting a goal, right? So you take a diagnostic test, you see where you're at, you understand your strengths and weaknesses, and then you're working towards improving it. And we tell our students, plan on taking the test at least twice, right?
Absolutely.
So you want to be able to fit it in at least twice. You can take it more, but it's meeting a goal. And I think that in itself has inherent value, right? There's value in identifying where you want to improve and then being able to see that. And schools also, if they see that you've taken it a couple times, they're also seeing that development and they're seeing that improvement. which
You know, a lot of people have expressed concern about taking it a second time or even a third time. There does, of course, come a point where you're going to probably plateau, and it doesn't make sense to take it 17 times. But
you can't take it.
You can't even take it. Yeah.
No, people. What is the max? How many times can you take it? I know you have to wait at least 15 days between tests, but
well, actually, not necessarily. So, first of all, in terms of limits, it's for the GMAT at least. We can talk about the executive assessment, and I honestly don't know as much about the GRE, but for the GMAT, it's 8 times maximum lifetime, 5 times in a rolling 12-month period. And yes, there is a waiting period within the same platform, but so there's 2 versions for both the GMAT, for all 3 tests, actually, the GRE and the executive assessment, an in-person exam as well as an online version of the exam. The online is a relatively new phenomena that's been introduced with really helping people circumvent test center closures because of COVID. But the online version of these tests is here to stay. It's not going away, which I think is a good thing. It adds flexibility for test takers. So for the GMAT, as well as the executive assessment, if you take a test, there is a 16-day waiting period to take the test in the same format, but there is 0 waiting period to take the test in another format. So, for example, someone who takes an in-person exam for either the GMAT or the executive assessment can literally the next day go take an online version of the same test.
it's kind of sadistic, but yeah.
What
I was going to say was that people who are concerned about taking it more than once, actually talking to other recruiters and admissions people, they're actually impressed by the fact that people who are willing to put their nose to the grindstone and make that effort to improve themselves, right? It speaks to your character that you're willing to get better than or do better than you had previously done. So I don't think that's something you should be concerned about. Again, there's a limit, right? But taking it twice, 3 times, I don't think is ever a problem.
Yeah, the GMAT data shows that after the 3rd attempt, scores really plateau. So if you're going to take it more than 3 times, you really need to have a good reason to believe you've done something on your end to have a difference in your score. And so, yes, there are sometimes people who, they'll just take it 2-3 times just thinking, oh, well, maybe I'll get lucky and get a great score. And they haven't really done anything in between. That's obviously not an ideal strategy. As Bara was saying, you want to understand your strengths and weaknesses and how can you improve your weaknesses from one attempt to the next. But there are people who don't do that. And so if you're going to take it more than 3 times, there has to be something you've done on your end to substantially improve your hopes of getting a better score.
Which I think is a really good plug for the both of us, Renee, which is that when you're dealing with prepping for these exams, there's lots of ways of doing it. You can do DIY, right? There's lots of books, there's things available online, and you can usher yourself through it. You can do group classes. You can do even like online group classes. But really, if you want to get the highest scores, the easiest way, it's not the only way, is to work with professionals that will help to create and curate for you what you need to do to improve your score. It's like you can learn to play tennis, by watching YouTube and by, playing, but you're going to get the most refined if you work with a professional to get you to the next level, like working with a trainer. So that's the way I do.
This example is not a bad one. Like you're inside yourself. It's hard to see the errors you're making. It's hard to get past your own limitations. And having a coach is always going to have a better result. All right. We've spoken a little bit about some of the complaints that people have had with GMAT and so forth. Maybe addressing that, or just in general, what are some of the adaptations that GMAC, for those who don't know, are the ones who create the GMAT, and ETS, who've created the GR, what it provided over the years to address these things?
Yeah, well, from the GMAC perspective, there's actually been several changes over the past, I'd say, 6 to 7 years. The first and probably most noteworthy is the shortening of the exam. So before, there's always been experimental questions, and the purpose of experimental questions are to validate that the questions are fair, they're not biased, before they get put into the live question pool. And so currently on the GMAT, there are 3 math questions that are experimental. There are 6 verbal questions that are experimental and 3 that are integrated reasoning questions that are experimental that don't count towards your score. So there used to be actually a lot more than that. So what the GMAT has done is realized that the test was fairly long, a bit tiring. They shortened the exam several years ago to cut out some of those experimental questions. Still have
3 hours, right? 3.5 hours now.
Exactly. So now we've got an exam that's about just over 3 hours in length, whereas it used to be closer to 4. we also have some other features that I think are really beneficial to test takers. First is what's called score preview. So you have the option to cancel your score or keep your score. And before, you didn't get to see what your score was. It was just like, well, do I think I did well? If so, I'll keep it. Well, now you can actually see your score upon completing the exam, and then you decide whether you keep the score or you cancel it. Furthermore, when you previously used to cancel your score, schools would tell that you took the test and cancel the score, which really, as a test taker, isn't very good, because the school would know if you canceled your score, you probably didn't do very well. Now, fortunately, schools do not have the ability to see that you canceled the score. They will only see the scores that you specifically have kept, and therefore have chosen to send to the school. So that's a big advantage.
Yeah.
Finally, select section order. Before, it was a fixed order in which you take the GMAT. Now you have the option to take it in 3 different orders, which I think is very beneficial, because the original order had the test taker take the essay and the integrated reasoning sections first, and those are the 2 sections that didn't count towards your overall score. So now we have the ability to take those last and take either quantitative or verbal first, which is a big advantage. And I guess finally, which we mentioned before, is the online version. So there's a lot more flexibility in, first of all, finding a test date, because the online version has a lot more availability. And I think it's also a lot more comforting taking the exam in the comfort of your home on a computer you're familiar with, as opposed to going to a bit more intimidating test center.
So is it unlimited, the amount of people who can take the online version each particular day?
I think it's unlimited, because there is going to be a limit based on proctors. There is an online proctoring, but
so how does that work? How do they prevent cheating in the online stuff?
Well, it is a lot of artificial intelligence. It's proctoring, so you do have to check in with a proctor. They do a webcam scan of your environment to make sure you don't have hidden notes. There's an artificial intelligence program that kind of looks, are your eyes looking up? Gee, maybe there's some hidden notes up there, up a lot. So, I think with anything there, nothing's going to be foolproof, but there are some artificial intelligence capabilities built in. We don't know exactly what they are for understandable reasons. Those are security controlled, so they're not publicly disclosed, but there are some controls to prevent that. But I do think it's advantageous for people to have the opportunity to take it online. And although there is, I'm sure, some limit, and on rare occasion, I've seen mainly on holiday weekends, a long weekend, I'll find, oh, now the test center or the online appointments are booked up, but that tends to be fairly unusual. Whereas, at least for the GMAT, trying to find an appointment in a test center, sometimes it's very challenging.
Yeah, especially in certain countries. Like you said, during COVID, it's really challenging. So it's pretty cool that they've made that adaptation. And I didn't know that you can pivot between like the online or in person when I not have to wait the 16 days. Because I know some people who just had a bad day. They either woke up on the wrong side of the bed, or they couldn't sleep, and they did much more poorly than they were doing in their simulations. So it's cool that they can just the next day or a couple of days later jump in and take that test.
Yeah, but the thing with that too, Eric, is that this is why my company deals with the mindset piece of it, right? Because you could have a bad day, or you can learn how to deal with it if you're having a bad day. So learning some skills of how to get focused and how to be on your best game is also, I think, not only great for the test, but it's great for life, right? If you're not feeling great and you've got a really important business meeting, what are you going to do, right?
You got to deliver anyway.
You got to deliver. And so learning how to deal with that, I think, is it's a great opportunity to do that for the test.
I feel like a lot of times we've talked about how either the test or the MBA itself is often a sort of metaphor for life.
Absolutely.
The amount of personal growth you do in these things is incredible. Absolutely. Another advantage that kind of comes to mind during the program, we've talked about kind of before the program, like in terms of, but during the program, when you think about it, the people with whom you're doing your MBA are going to very much determine the success I think you have in your career afterwards. And that's where there's a whole lot of filtering that goes on, the GMAT, the interview, the essays, and so forth. There are tools to filter and identify the right people to participate into the program based on the kind of program that the school offers, the culture of the school, the teaching style, and so forth. So if you think about it, schools or programs that may not have any sort of control in place, you have to think about the other kind of people that might be in the program. And I think you want to be surrounded by people who are just as good, if not better, so to speak, than you, that are going to only elevate you and encourage you and push you to work harder and be better. So there's that. We're talking about hidden advantages, seeing the test as a tool to ensure that you're going to be surrounded by people who are great and that are going to make, as collectively make each other greater.
And everyone has positive qualities, right? So someone might score lower on the GMAT, but they might bring something else to the pool. So when people are compiling the classes, they're really looking at all of these different pieces and what is that class going to look like? There are going to be some high scorers that might be socially awkward, and there might be lower scorers who are really socially adept and have certain work experiences that are going to lend themselves to the health of the entire class that the admissions person is putting together.
Yeah.
Sure.
Oh,
sorry. Go ahead, Vinay.
No, I was going to say, I also find that people who tend to do well on the GMAT tend to have the right, to Bara's point, have the right mindset, which means there's really two ways to look at any of these exams. Either I view this as a challenge, I'm going to put my best effort, I've got a positive outlook, I'm going to improve, I'm going to do well, or, just complaining, why do I have to do this? This is so unfair. This is ridiculous. Why do I have to do this? And that kind of mindset is not going to lead to success on the test or further in life. So it really is about having the right mindset and outlook towards the test and viewing this as a personal challenge. How can I grow, improve myself, and what can I do to do well?
Yeah, it's a growth mindset. A growth
absolutely.
Mindset. Fixed. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we kind of got into this a little bit earlier, and this is running a little bit longer than we usually run MBA Waves. So we're already about almost 40 minutes in, 37 minutes in. Some advantages after the test. You mentioned about companies. Why do you think that is? Any comments about that are going to require a GMAT score?
I think for management consulting firms, if you think about what they do, it really is about looking at a complex problem and how do we deliver that kind of valid solution to our clients. And because the GMAT is so focused on those critical thinking skills, it really is a nice complement, I think, to the case studies that management consulting firms do as part of the interview process to really assess someone's critical thinking abilities.
I'd agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, let's not also forget that these are some of the most sought after companies, right? And they must have loads of applicants each year, or every hiring period. And so it's just another tool they have to focus on what they perceive at least to be the right people. All right. Any final comments for this or any other questions from the audience? Now's the time. You have some fantastic testing coaches here. If you want to ask any questions, this is your moment. Also, you can see their websites right on the screen. Well, actually, Vinay, is GMAT Genius the website? GMATgenius.com?
Exactly. GMATgenius.com.
I'm just going to punctuate what we were just talking about. Coming towards the GMAT and the GRE and the executive assessment with a growth mindset, it is definitely something that you can learn. It's a skill. It's just a muscle that seeing this as a challenge and an opportunity for growth is going to be a lot better than, getting upset and annoyed by the whole prospects of it, because life is filled with of situations that we don't love, and we can either use that as a launch or we can use that to push us down. So really having that growth mindset is something that I encourage people to embody.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think that's spot on, Bara. I think related to that, as we approach the test with a growth mindset, we need to think about what it is we need to do to improve. So, and that's where I think to your point, Bara, before, working with someone who can help you identify what are the mistakes you're making, what are maybe some common traps that you keep falling into is essential, because that's how you're ultimately going to improve. If you keep doing the same thing over and over again, you're not going to improve. You need to understand, what mistakes am I making? Why am I making them? And how do I stop making those mistakes? And what do I need to do differently? And you need a way to identify that and implement those changes. That's ultimately how you're going to improve and grow.
Yep, agreed. Eric, you got any other questions for us?
Yeah, there's a little bit of a glitch with the internet, I think. I'm not sure how it is on your side, but no, I think that's the end of today's episode. So let's just mention next week what we're talking about on MBA Waves. We're going to talk about CVs, resumes. So getting your resume MBA ready. And I'm not sure if we're going to have anyone join us next week, but we'll see about that. Again, for the future schedule, check out mbawaves.com. Thank you so much, Vinay, for joining us.
Thank you, Vinay.
Oh, no, thank you, Bara and Eric. It was a pleasure.
Everyone have a great day.
And thank you, Bara, and everyone in the audience. Have a good day, everyone.
Bye. Bye. Bye.